Okay. Hi, my name is Ionel Cucu, and I work currently at Subvision, and I'm a front-ender. So I work full-time as a front-end developer, mostly working with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. And today I am going to introduce you into the CSS Grid, a new feature introduced recently, and most important, it's a very beautiful or very useful feature that will save, let's say, our lives. Okay? My talk today is called Better Layouts with CSS Grids. Why I say better? We'll see later because we already do layouts with different tools. Before starting right into the details, I'm going to show you again the sponsors of CodeCamp this year. Yeah, and let's dive right in. So again, can you hear me very well in the back? Okay. One thing I want to mention is about table. Table was introduced in the first specification of HTML when HTML came out in 1993. This is an example of a website. It's Yahoo in 1997, a few years later. But as you can see, it doesn't have much of a good design because at that time there wasn't CSS available for the developers. But what we can notice in this layout is that at that time there was a need for multiple columns and multiple cells in a design. So this design of Yahoo at that year has only 2 columns. Yeah, so it started right from the first pages. It started with the need of multiple columns, multiple rows, or something like that. And in the first place, it was table that was used for that. I think we all are accustomed to table. We all know how to use table mostly, right? But after the table, float came in. The floats were used for the layouts. Actually, the floats were created mainly for floating an image and also wrap the text around it. You may know that. So the floats were created for that purpose, but actually the developers found a new way of using floats to design web pages, to create layouts. After the floats, there was another thing. There was inline block. How many of you have used inline block to create columns, layouts? Right? So it's another tool, but actually it wasn't meant for that. So inline block wasn't meant for layout, it wasn't meant for columns. After inline block, we also use sometimes display table. You know about that, right? So we hit that question, hey, why are you using table for the layout? Okay, so I can answer, I'm using divs or something else, but using also display table to make them look like table or act like tables, right? But that is a hack. It's also something that it wasn't meant to be used as a columns, as a tool for creating layouts with columns and cells or something like that. And then Flex came out with different specifications, different forms, let's say. So Flex came out, and Flex aimed to resolve some of the issues that we have with floats, with table, and so on, right? How many of you are using Flex right now? At the same time, how many of you are using Bootstrap? Right? Yeah, Bootstrap 3, for example, was using floats for the columns, right? And then Bootstrap 4, the new version, is using also Flex for the columns. But Flex wasn't meant for the whole page layout. Flex works in one dimension, right? Then comes the grid. The grid is a new feature introduced recently and also adopted by the majority of browsers this year. So we can start using it. But let's see how grid solves some problems. I mean, there is a problem, there should be a solution. Our problem is that when we have that beautiful design that we need to integrate a new design, a beautiful design into our application, we have to put a lot of wrappers. A wrapper for some columns, a wrapper for the header, a wrapper for the footer, a wrapper for something else, right? We need wrappers and wrappers. But at some point we found ourselves in a difficult situations in not being able to separate the content from the presentation, the CSS actually, the layout, the design of the content, right? And the solution would be a tool, would be a feature that allows us to do exactly that, to do layouts in multiple dimensions and to separate the constraints, right? Let's talk about a bit. Let's talk a bit about the floats, about what we're using right now, about what has been with us for years and it's still used. Floats. Floats were treated or are hack floats. A float is a hack from the start. So right from the start, when they created floats, it was meant for, like I said, an image in an article to be floated and some text to wrap around. And using it for columns, it is a hack. Why? Because you see down there, it features some containers for the rows and cells, right? But it has some major disadvantages. And one of them is that the floats are not responsive. And we hit that block every time we use floats and we want to implement something beautiful and something responsive. And you know that response becomes a little bit more complex as we go with different resolutions, right? It doesn't take care of the space around it. It doesn't take care of the free space, of the height, and so on. So another disadvantage of the float is you cannot do equal column heights. How many of you have struggled with this situation? How many of you had some columns, right? So I think it's a pretty common situation every time we implement something, and is a pretty common situation also in Bootstrap. For you, the guys that are using Bootstrap, right? Bootstrap offers a wrapper for the columns that are floats to keep them in the same row and also to clear them, because you know when you have a parent and we have floats in it, the parent doesn't see the floating elements, right? And another major disadvantage, a drawback for this, is the source ordering that defines the order of display of elements. So if I have an order in the HTML source code, if I have some divs, some main content, some main elements, some aside, header and footer, it will appear in the same order in the page. But if I want to change the order, that's a bit tricky. And I can say it's more trickier because we need to use JavaScript. So we need to make use of JavaScript to do something that is strictly related to the UI. Then it comes the Flexbox. Flexbox is the first feature that treats the layout, taking care of the white space, right? Putting elements all together and being more responsive. But actually, it works on one dimension. And one dimension means on horizontal or vertical axis. The Flexbox features flex containers acting like a row, and also features flex items. So I cannot have like one item, hey, let's make it stretch all the way down there, right? Without having a wrapper for it. So, you know, there's a downside of using it sometimes, all right? So, Flexbox is best at vertical aligning. How many of you, again, have struggled with vertical aligning multiple lines of text in a container or something like that? Is that a common problem for you sometimes when you're using CSS? I think it is, because we probably most of the time we use multiple lines and we want something to be vertical aligned, like in the buttons or some boxes. But like I said, Flexbox has some disadvantages as well. It works in one dimension. It doesn't allow us to create full featured layouts. And the browser support and the syntax is a little bit challenging. Probably for the guys that were switching from floats and provide some interest to you, hey, let's find out what Flexbox is about, and you found yourself in a situation not understanding at the first time most of the items. And the grid comes in, right? This is like a solution. I mean, it's not the perfect, because we may have different situations where the tools doesn't fit our needs, right? The grid is first designed to lay out all pages. That means we can use the grid, this feature, to design pages from top to bottom, from left to right, from top to bottom, on both vertical and horizontal axes. And it's similar to the table layouts. It has columns and rows, something that we used when we designed the pages using tables. A feature and something interesting is that grid is as well very easy to reorder boxes. So it uses an order property to reorder boxes. What does it mean? For you guys, if you haven't used it, floats. When we use floats, like I said before, we have a certain elements in the page, and they appear in the same order in our browser, right? So moving them or swapping them together is tricky. It involves JavaScript. But with Grid, we have a property called order, and based on that, we can switch elements, swap them around, and remove some of them. But Grid, being a new feature introduced, it also doesn't provide support in all browsers. It is right now supported in all major browsers, but you guess something, which one is not supporting it right now? And the syntax is challenging as well. So for newcomers that want to learn something and want to take a look at Grid, it may be challenging at first. The problem using floats, something mentioned earlier, you have no equal height columns. It's an old problem, and it's common, right? It requires a clear fix. Every time we put some floats element in the page, it requires a clear fix. Item positions depends on the source order, and yeah, it's very important, it's not responsive. It's not responsive at all. Being able to put percentages on a float, it doesn't mean it is responsive, right? All right. So here's an example of two elements that are floating inside a container, the blue container, right? The container is called wrapper here. As you can see, it's a block, padding, right? And we have the columns here that are floating, all right? And I said it is not responsive, right? I have to take care of the space, of the width, and so on. Look, I have a width and a cal expression because I want the float element to be 50% and also minus 10%, right? Because have some margins, because the margin doesn't come with floats, all right? And the most important, we need a clear fix. If we don't put a clear fix, the parent element, the wrapper, doesn't see the height of the elements and is squishy, right? Another situation, and I represent it visually, is, like I said, when we have multiple columns and we want equal heights. We have the same implementation as before. One of the columns gets bigger because it has more content in it, right? But the other column doesn't expand. So this is a major problem of floats. Another problem illustrated here is that we have to put many wrappers on the page, right? Many wrappers to keep them in place, to keep those elements. Let's take a look like this class. I have a static wrapper, the site wrapper, sorry. I have a header, right? And then I want my content to be on two columns. But in order to put two columns, I need a wrapper first. This is the site content because it has to hold them together. And then I have the content area. Why do I need a content area? Because the content area has to hold in place all those items in the same column, right? And this is the problem of floats. A layout with grid with the same component, let's say, doesn't have that wrappers. So for this example, I have the static, the site. Sorry again, I read it wrong. The site wrapper. I have the header, right? And then I have only the main container which defines the component. In it, I can have any other elements, but it features the component, another component on the other side. So as you can see, there's no wrapper around them. So that can be achieved with the grid. Actually, what is CSS Grid after this talk? The CSS Grid is a new feature. It's basically a layout that excels at dividing a page into major regions. It allows us to create cells, to create areas in our page, and also to add some distance between them. And it helps us not taking care of that space using margins. Probably you found that situation when working with Bootstrap with columns, right? And the columns have some paddings, but the rows have some negative margins and something like that. And when you define something on your own without a framework, you put yourself a question. Where should I put the margin? To the left or to the right? Or on both sides or something like that, right? The grid, like I said, it's a new feature. It's a new feature, and it introduces into the CSS new terms, right? Once we have the grid, we have new terms. One of them is the grid lines. Something that we didn't have before is the grid lines. We have lines for vertical and horizontal. We'll see later what they are used for. We have grid tracks. What is a track? It's a new term introduced by grid, and it means either a row or a column, right? We have grid cells. What is a cell? It's the intersection between a column and a row. We have areas. Those are terms like that we will find into the CSS properties, right? What is the area? Area is bound by 4 grid lines. I mean, it involves multiple cells, right? And what is an item? An item is something that we put inside a cell. It's called an item. The grid also introduces another unit, another measurement unit, let's say, but it's actually a unit, yeah? Something that we haven't had before. What is that? Is the fraction of FR. We've had pixels, ems, rems, percentage, something like that, VH, VW, right? But now we have FR. And we will discuss that, but here we have an illustration of all the items in one page. As you can see, we have the lines, the ones with dash line right here. When we created layouts using tables, the basic table we created, we didn't have the term of line, only the cell and rows, right? Now we have the line because it will be used to create the grid and also to position the elements. We have this is the line, right? Highlighted right here, okay? We have the tracks, like I said, either be a column or row, like this. We have the area. area consists of multiple cells in the table, right? Like this. And here's a bit of code to show you how you can create a grid. It's actually, we need a wrapper, right? And most of the times we don't put the grid on a body, so we need a wrapper for that, but to keep all the cells inside. And we define the grid, display grid, like we have before, display table or display flex. Now we have display grid. Putting there display grid makes it acts like a grid, but we need to define more. Like we need to define where to put the columns, like how big they are, where to put the rows, how big they are, how small, how much space, and something like that. And here we define the template, the template for the rows, right? What it means, the template, is like, this is how we define a row, but actually, as we put content in the page, it will add many rows. So we want, in the first example, we want to create some columns. The first column, like you can see, we can use fixed units, like 100 pixels. But then I have two other columns of one fraction. And we will discuss what one fraction is, actually. Right? And at the bottom, there's another example. There's another example with other many features introduced by CSS Grid. And that's why I mentioned earlier that it is a bit tricky at first. When you come in, it's a bit tricky to understand everything because some of them weren't before in CSS. And in that example, we have the fraction unit. It is a flexible unit that takes care of the remaining white space of the elements. Imagine that situation when you want to put 3 columns on the page, one column to be fixed at 100 pixels, the second one at 100 pixels, and no, let's say one fixed and two other to be flexible. But the two others, I want them to share the space equally, right? How can I do that with the units that I had before? I can imagine putting the 50% somewhere, right? But 50% to some columns means 50% from the parent. I have to subtract using cal expression down 100 pixels, and it's a bit trickier. So using fraction, I just tell that column, hey, use one fraction of the remaining white space. So it takes the white space, divides into 2 columns, and that's the way you put the column on the page. But the fraction unit is not like the other units. It's not exactly like the pixel or percentage or ems. Because, like I said, you cannot compute that, right? You cannot compute the fraction unit. It is there to take care of the remaining white space, and it cannot be used in the calc expressions, right? How to place an item in a grid? We can place an item in a grid using line numbers. The new term introduced by CSS Grid, something that we haven't had before, is the line numbers. We can use explicit line names. We can put names on each line. Why should I do that? It's because I can reference them easily later. Because at some point, working with numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 10 or something like that, it's trickier, right? And we can place an item on the grid using grid areas, like some blocks of multiple cells. Here's an example of a grid having 2 rows, 3 columns, and as you can see, here's the mention for the lines. We have the line numbers. And one thing to mention, it was created for the designers as well. So designers count from 1 to 10, not from 0 to 9 like the programmers. All right? So it's something that you may find tricky as a programmer. That's why some of the programmers found it a bit like not a programming language to learn CSS, and it's a bit different. Yeah, it needs to be understood by designers as well, because designers work with the layout with the design. So the numbers start at 1. You have to deal with that. Yeah. So placing an item with the numbers is like this. It's simple, but actually, this is my cell, this is my element, it's a grid item, and I want it to be positioned at the row level between line 1 and 3. Something like that. Between line 1 and 3. And the column between column 1 and 2. And going forward, placing it between line 1 and 3. Thus, it will occupy 2 cells. And occupy the column from line 1 to 2. It is a bit tricky, as you can see from this line. You quickly imagine it occupies 2 columns, right? Grid column. So the grid columns, like this is the columns. So it goes from 1 to 2. It doesn't occupy 2 columns. It's only 1 because it starts from the first line and goes to the second one, right? And for the rows, it goes to from 1 to 3, something like this, from 1 to 3, like yeah. That was positioning with numbers, but like I said, sometimes we found it useful to work with names. The guys that were working on CSS Grid thought about that and also introduced names for lines. So hey, I can call the names like this. I want a grid column for the first and main name. I'm not going to too much into the technical details and going to talk about everything that Grids introduces, but I just want to give you an idea, also give an introduction, and also see how it works and what it solves for you, right? Here's a simple layout. Here's a simple layout using having a header, a sidebar, a main, and a footer, right? But the sidebar occupies 2 cells. And using floats, you can imagine we have a container up there and another container right here holding inside the left column and then the right column and so on. Because we're working with grid, we don't need that, right? So let's take a look how simply it is to place those items in those places with grid. Let's imagine a header, a sidebar on the side, a main in the middle, and a footer on the side as well, right? This is it basically. What it is, we need a wrapper like I said before. It is a display grid. We need to define it, like act like a grid. And inside, that's a cool feature that catch your attention, right? It is a new feature and very, very useful. I can define grid areas so I can say afterwards where to put the columns or the blocks or the components, right? A template like this, look how visually it is. Down up there we have the header, at the side we have the sidebar, and then we have the main and the footer. That's how I create the layout, and that's how I put the names. And there are the components themselves. I want the header to go where? To go to the header, right there, occupy 2 boxes. I want the main element, this is the HTML element. I want the main element to go where? Go there. The sidebar also go on the left side. And the footer goes to the footer, right? And this is it. Imagine that working with floats. And one thing I added afterwards at the code is the grid gap. It's something we needed until now, but we didn't find it in CSS. It's a gap. It's something that acts like a general space, let's say something equal in the grid, and you don't have to take care of it using margins. Is that space between columns when you have to put margin left on the side or padding something or something like that? There's a grid gap. I will show you another example. So here is a grid, right? It is a grid, that features the lines and also some blocks, some elements already put on the page. This one, right, is on the grid row 3, grid column 2. As you can see, those are different properties because, like I said, grid introduces a new, a multiple feature and properties in order to allow us to work with it in different ways. So in this case, I'm gonna say to tell this element to go for the grid row 3 and grid column 2. And in this case, I want to span it from the row 2, from the line 2 to line 5, like this, right? And the column 3, another way to tell it where to go is like we start from the line 3, but I want the element to span across 2 columns, and that's what it does. So I can explicitly tell go from 3 to 5, or I can tell it go from 3 but span 2 columns, because I don't know the number or the name, right? And inside a grid, we have different tools, different properties to align the elements. And most of the properties are working the same, kind of the same as they work in Flexbox. So if you are familiar with Flexbox, like with justify or align items, justify content, justify items, it was kind of the same. So we have a property called justify items that has different value to align the element into a cell or a grid, right? I just don't go to through each other because this is for the row axis. The row axis is taken care by justify items, and the column axis is taken care by align items with the same properties and values. So align items with a start, an end, a center, a stretch. And a visual representation is like this. I have a grid, right? This is the grid. 2 rows and 2 columns. But I want to position my component not to stretch all the grid like all the columns. So I have the properties align self to put on the same element with a value of stretch, and it stretches to fill all the space inside the grid box, a grid cell. But if I want this to be like in this corner, to sit in this corner, like I said, on the horizontal axis, right? We have justify self start because I want from the start, from the left. The end would be at the right. And for the vertical alignment, if we want them to be at the end, we put align self at the end. And that's how we put in that order. And if we want them to be centered, like I said, it works mostly like Flexbox. We have align self-center, center, and justify self-center, right? Here's an animation how the items are placed inside the box, right? Using the values up there, as you can see, those are the values changing, right? Justify self for the horizontal and aligning for the column. Grid items order. Let's talk a bit about that. Grid items can be ordered using the property order, right? By default, their value is 0, and that makes us to start using the value of 1, like I said before. It was created with designers in mind as well, right? So using this property order for the grid allows us to not change the markup in the source order. And there comes the question and the situation of working with responsive grid design. It works with all units in CSS, so we can put all the units like I showed you before. Provides another responsive unit called fraction. Like I said, it's easy to reword elements by order, right? For a certain resolution, you can change the main layout by changing the wrapper properties. Like this. Here's an example of a layout. And here's the wrapper for the elements, right? there are the names for the areas, the header, main, site, footer. But in some situations, I want a different layout. What do? I haven't included all the CSS code here, but only what's interesting. It's like when we put a media query or something like that, where whenever we need that, we just change the names in that layout, and everything gets positioned accordingly to that, right? So before we have the side on the right side and main on the left, and here we have the side on the left, and also the header occupying two cells, right? And if we want them to, let's say on the mobile, to work like a stacked layout, we can simply go for the wrapper and say display block. Because we say display block, they act naturally like some divs, like some blocks from top to bottom. Right? One thing to mention is the browser support. I said IE10 and IE11 and Edge support an old version of the spec. Do you imagine that? Only Internet Explorer and Edge. Basically, Edge tries to get up to speed with the other browsers, but it's still there. It's still down there. What we can say is, if we haven't had Internet Explorer 10, we wouldn't be able to use Grid right now. Guess what? The Grid was introduced by Microsoft on Internet Explorer 10. And they left the work there. They created the first spec, and it wasn't interesting enough to continue. Something like that. But the other browsers, the other vendors, thought it's a beautiful thing. It's very, very useful. So they implemented it, and right now you can find it. You can find support for Grid in all browsers, all other browsers. This is accurate right now. As you can see, on IE11 and 10 is excluded because it doesn't matter. But IE11 offers support for an older specification. What does it mean? It means we don't have all the properties like in the other browsers, and some of them require the prefix, like -ms, something like that. We need to define specifically for Internet Explorer. But the other browsers, as you can see, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, Opera, iOS, Safari, Opera Mini is not there. Android browser, they all support the Grid. And what I can tell you right now is we don't have frameworks, like Bootstrap doesn't include CSS Grid right now. Foundation doesn't have Grid, but actually in the works. I know it's something in the works, so we will have it in some frameworks, so we can use them in our project, right? And here I noticed some resources for you to start up learning. I mean, it is easy to go on Google right now and search for CSS Grid. It is easy to find some other good resources, but I recommend starting with this one. So because some of them, like Grid by Example, offer some examples, right? Not only technical details. And here we can find a full tutorial or course, right? Complete guide on the Grid. And basically, thank you. That was it, mostly.